I begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which we live today as we join in this Zoom meeting. I'm on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respect to their elders past and present, and to any First Nation person who will take part in this forum. And if you wish, please acknowledge country in the chat. On behalf of the Australian Fair Trade and Investment Network, welcome and thanks for joining in this important forum about the contents of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP, signed a month ago on November 15. We've 7 speakers today, each making a 7-minute presentation on different aspects of the RCEP text, and we should have almost 45 minutes for Q&A from participants. So we will close at 2 p.m. or when the questions and comments are exhausted. We will have the 7 presentations in sequence without questions, and then the Q&A when they're completed. You could write questions in the chat, but you will be able to indicate to me if you want to ask a question or make a comment, and you can go on camera to ask the question yourself. But let's begin now with our first presentation. So the forum is being recorded so that AFTINET can provide video highlights through our social media. Our first speaker is Dr. Patricia Ranald. She is a research associate at the University of Sydney and convener of the Australian Fair Trade and Investment Network. She will give a brief overview of the COVID-19 pandemic and RCEP, and a brief analysis of investment and e-commerce chapters. There you go, Pat.
Hi, everyone. In terms of an overview, and thanks for the introduction, Peter, I'm going to sort of race through it a bit, but we all know that the RCEP is Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea, and the China and the 10 ASEAN countries, and that India left in 2019. There's been no independent study of this economic or social impacts, but without India, it's worth much less to Australia because we have FTAs with all the other countries. Its main advantage is supposed to be common customs and other trade standards, but it doesn't have any labour or environmental standards. Now, there's no investor-state dispute system. That means that corporations are not able to sue governments under this agreement. There's no investor-state dispute settlement, but there is state-to-state dispute settlement, which is the normal form of dispute settlement that exists for all trade agreements. And the ISDS provisions are going to be reviewed in 2 years. I'll talk about those more later. But even the state-to-state dispute settlement doesn't apply to 8 of the 20 chapters. And this is also going to be reviewed 2 years after implementation as part of a broader review. Overall, the RCEP is less restrictive of government regulation than the comprehensive TPP, but that could change after the review in 2 years. And the government has now postponed the parliamentary inquiry into the TPP, into the RCEP, so it's not going to begin for until February next year. Now, the other things I was going to look at are the investment rules, and those are in Chapter 10. Basically, these rules aim to encourage investment and reduce government regulation. And as I said, they're enforced by a state-to-state disputes process only. There's no provisions for corporations, individual corporations, to be able to sue governments. No ISDS, but it will be discussed after 2 years and be implemented only if all countries agree. Foreign investors have to be treated equally with local investors and no less favourably from those from other countries. And investors must have fair and equitable treatment, or FET, full protection and security, and be compensated for direct expropriation or nationalisation of their investment. But the definitions of fair and equitable treatment and indirect expropriation give more room for government regulation than in the TPP. And I'm happy to answer questions, more detailed questions about that if people have later. Now, the way the investment chapter works is that there's the rules in chapter 10, and then there's a list of reservations in a document called Annex 3. And these are investments that are not covered by the rules. So the structure is a negative list for Annex 3, which means that all areas of investment are covered except those listed as reservations. And there's two lists in Annex 3. List A reserves existing regulation at state and local and some national regulations, but freezes regulation at current levels, which can't be increased. And this is known as the ratchet structure. So in List A, you reserve existing regulation, but you can't increase it in future. In List B, there are those areas of regulation which governments can increase in future or make new regulation, including any measure on national security. And I'll just quickly go over those List B areas, because this is the areas where governments have reserved the right to increase regulation. It's similar to the CPTPP, but as I said, there's no ISDS, so corporations can't, under the CPTPP, even if things were listed as reservations for state-to-state disputes, there was a possibility that corporations could sue. That's not the case under the RCEP. So there's a general national security reservation. There's reservations for ownership of Australian land valued over $15 million and agribusiness above 60 million. There's other reservations are law enforcement and corrections, income security or insurance, social security or insurance and social welfare, public education and public training, and also regulation of admissions, accreditation and funding of private and public education services. Public utilities, public transport and public housing are all reserved, as are health and childcare, but not aged care. That's a significant omission, I think. And also the regulation of environmental services is not reserved except for water for human use. And in particular, environmental services do include regulation of air pollution, so that could impact on regulation to reduce carbon emissions in future. And I'll just speak briefly about the e-commerce chapter. Again, this has a bit more room for regulation than either the CPTPP or the Singapore Digital Economy Agreement, which was only came into force last week. So the chapter does aim to deregulate cross-border data flows and to forbid rules on local presence, as do the previous two agreements, particularly the Singapore DEA. But again, there's much more room in this agreement for governments to regulate in those areas, because each government can determine its own public interest and national security reservations, and these can't be disputed. So although the chapter says we will deregulate, it then says but governments can regulate if they, it's a self-monitoring regulation that can't be disputed. And governments can also still require a local presence and access to and regulation of source code. Both of those things are deregulated in the Singapore DEA. And there's no application to financial services providers or data, which again is different from the Singapore DEA, but this is to be discussed in 2 years. And there's also the state-to-state dispute settlement does not apply to this chapter, but that non-application is going to be reviewed after 2 years. So the general picture of the RCEP and of this chapter is that it has the same sort of structure, deregulatory structure, as the CPTPP, but it allows more room for governments to regulate, except in those areas that I've specifically discussed. So rules on trade in goods in particular limit the possibility of industry development policies from government, because what they say is not only that you can't have tariffs in the long run, you should have zero tariffs, but you should also, government should not do anything which favours local industry. Now, there are some exceptions to this, but generally speaking, the framework is that it discourages governments from having positive local industry development policies. And of course, what we've learned from COVID is that we do have a lack of local manufacturing capacity in essential areas like health equipment, for example, PPE and ventilators. So the AMWU and other unions have been developing a whole industry set of policy initiatives, and even the current government is saying it wants some industry development policies. So the RCEP kind of ignores all that, and its basic framework doesn't really favour that sort of development. I'll leave it there. Thanks. And I have to stop sharing.
Yes, that's right. Thank you very much, Pat. Our next speaker is Dr. Deborah Gleeson. She's a senior lecturer in public health at La Trobe University. Her primary research area is the implications of trade agreements for public health and access to medicines. She co-convenes the Political Economy of Health Special Interest Group in the Public Health Association of Australia and plays a leading role in PHAA's advocacy on trade agreements and health. Deborah will focus on access to medicines in the RCEP. So go ahead, please, Deborah.
Thanks very much, Peter, and thank you, Pat, for inviting me to speak today. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I'm giving this presentation, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. So far I've only had an opportunity to go through the intellectual property chapter of RCEP in detail and look at all the provisions closely. But I have to say that there's, in comparison with many of the other trade agreements that are being negotiated or have been negotiated recently, there are very few of the really nasty things that we've seen in intellectual property chapters in terms of pharmaceuticals in other agreements. So the RCEP intellectual property chapter is lacking a lot of the TRIPS Plus provisions that we've seen in trade agreements negotiated by the US and the EU, and is looking a lot better than we expected earlier on in the negotiations, but there still are some remaining concerns with the provisions that are in there. So during the negotiations, public health people got quite alarmed about the proposals that were being made for the RCEP intellectual property chapter. In February 2015, there were leaked proposals from a number of the parties in the negotiations. And we saw, to our surprise, that Japan and South Korea had both proposed patent term extensions, and Japan had also proposed an expanded scope of patentability and data exclusivity. So these are all provisions that we know can increase the cost of medicines, keep generic medicines out of the market for longer. And that was particularly a concern because we had India in the agreement at that stage. And India, of course, is known as the pharmacy of the developing world because it manufactures so many generic medicines and exports them to developing countries that don't have their own manufacturing capacity. And also because RCEP had a number of very poor countries, particularly Cambodia, Laos and Myanmar. So, I mean, it's in a way, it's not much of a surprise because Japan and South Korea both have burgeoning research-based pharmaceutical industries, and we know that the global pharmaceutical industry operates very much on a transnational basis, and the affiliates of the big global transnationals lobby governments in all of the countries in which they're manufacturing and marketing their pharmaceuticals, basically along the same sorts of lines. So in a way, it could be expected that the TRIPS Plus provisions that we've seen proposed by mainly the US and the EU to date would be taken up by other countries in their trade negotiations as their pharmaceutical industries start to look a bit more like the US and the EU. ASEAN and India both put counter proposals and sought an agreement that didn't go beyond the TRIPS agreement. And I think the fact that the outcomes were not nearly as bad as we thought they might be at this stage in the agreement was largely because of the participation of India in the agreement, and also the fact that the ASEAN countries negotiated as a bloc. And so I think that Japan and South Korea's proposals didn't get very much sympathy in the trade negotiations. There was another leaked draft in April 2016, which showed Japan's proposals for patent term and data exclusivity were still in the text, but bracketed and opposed by the other negotiating countries. So in the final RCEP IP text, those provisions specifically applying to pharmaceuticals like patent term extensions and data exclusivity were gone from the final draft, which is really good news. So all of the big ticket TRIPS plus intellectual property provisions that we have focused on in other trade agreements are not included in the RCEP, which is really good, particularly since there are some very poor countries involved that already struggle to provide access to medicines. However, there are some provisions that we do have concerns about. So one of them is that the RCEP IP text requires countries to ratify or accede to, if they haven't already acceded to, various multilateral intellectual property agreements, including the Patent Cooperation Treaty. It provides for patent protection or some equivalent type of protection for plant varieties, which means that countries need to provide monopolies on seeds. And there are relatively strong, in fact, surprisingly strong intellectual property enforcement measures for a trade agreement that includes a lot of developing countries. So the sorts of IP enforcement measures that are included in Section J of the IP text include not just civil measures to enforce intellectual property rights, but also criminal procedures and penalties for counterfeiting on a commercial scale, and those include imprisonment as well as fines. And more concerning, provisions for destruction of counterfeit goods without compensation, and forfeiture or destruction of associated implements, machinery and things for making goods, labels and packaging and so on. And also suspension of release of suspected counterfeit goods by customs authorities at the borders, either on application of a rights holder or on custom authorities' initiative. So the concern here is, and these provisions don't actually apply to patents, they apply to trademark goods and copyright goods and so on. But the concern is that there could be legitimate generic medicines being shipped from one country to another that are perceived to be counterfeit when they're actually not, they're actually legitimate. And they could be, suspended and prevented from entering the country, or even potentially destroyed and, and so on. And, the fact that that suspension of release can be initiated by the rights holder, I think, is the real concern. We know that that Australia and New Zealand were particularly interested in seeing grace periods for patents, so a 12-month period where someone who's applying for a patent can use information that's out in the public domain already to support their patent application. There wasn't a grace period agreed in the RCEP IP chapter, but the countries commit to cooperating on matters related to grace periods. So there's likely to be further discussions on that topic. The parties can still utilise the TRIPS transition periods that they're eligible for, which is good. But there are party-specific transition periods for certain provisions, which vary from country to country, so I won't go into detail about them. And they're mainly the enforcement provisions and a few others. But these are fixed periods of time, 10 years or 5 years, or 10 years with the addition of a possible 5 years, which I'm not quite sure how that will work out in relation to the transition periods that they have access under TRIPS, which for the least developed countries are meant to last for as long as they're least developed countries. So there's not a fixed time when those expire. So I think the main concerns and risks for developing countries related to the provisions on patents and anything that's relevant to pharmaceuticals in this chapter is firstly that the issue of patents on plant varieties, which has issues for seeds, obviously not related to access to medicines, but a big issue for developing countries. The potential for seizure of generic medicines that are suspected as counterfeit drugs. And, the pharmaceutical industry, the research-based pharmaceutical industry has a strong interest in, kind of undermining the legitimacy of generics and drawing, alignment between counterfeits and generics. So this is something that I'm sure the industry pushed very hard for and will try to make use of. There are question marks around whether the transition periods will be enough for the least developed countries. And I guess whether they, countries like Cambodia and Myanmar, they really shouldn't be putting their public resources into, developing the administrative structures and architecture for doing a lot of these things. So the extent of public resources in terms of both money and human resources in just setting up a lot of the infrastructure around these things is a huge drain on developing countries, and particularly when it's all around enforcing the private rights of wealthy corporations from wealthy countries. And I think a number of countries actually have requested technical assistance to actually set up those types of mechanisms, which shows that they actually really don't have the capacity to be doing those things. And I guess the biggest issue is not so much what's in the RCEP intellectual property chapter, but what's not in it, because of course we face a huge public health crisis around the world at the moment. There's a lot of effort going on to try and rethink the way we fund research and development for pharmaceuticals, and the way at the moment high prices are linked to monopolies and intellectual property rights. We need a different type of regime. We don't need to cement in place the one that we have. And even though the RCEP intellectual property chapter doesn't go as far as other intellectual property chapters have, it still sets in place that common architecture across the region, when we actually need to be opening the space for thinking about things differently, and also thinking about how we can support local production in many developing countries, so that they're not dependent on highly priced drugs from Western countries. And I think I'll finish up there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deborah. Our next presenter is Damien Kyloh. He's Associate Director, Economic and Social Policy at the Australian Council of Trade Unions. He's going to discuss the absence of workers' rights in the RCEP text and the Movement of People chapter and the Government Procurement chapter. So over to you, Damien.
Great. Thank you, Peter, and thank you so much for having me. It's a great privilege to be here and to speak. First of all, I'm going to look at the fact that there's no labour chapter in this agreement. I had the easiest job of analysing the legal text for this part, because there is no legal text for the labour chapter. But I do want to say a few words about this, because it's obviously a key criticism going forward, and something we shall be raising politically and campaigning on going forward. When we look at the countries, the RCEP countries, over half of the 15 countries party to the RCEP agreement are actually ranked amongst the worst countries in the world to work, where workers effectively have very little rights. And this is according to the ITUC, the International Trade Union Confederation's 2020 Global Rights Index. So we're dealing with countries which are have very serious concerns, yet there is no labor chapter whatsoever. And there are numerous examples we could give. So whether it's child labor in Cambodia, I was looking through the list of products which the ITUC see as having child labor as products in Cambodia. We're talking about alcoholic beverages, fish, meat, rubber, salt, shrimp, sugarcane, textiles, or whether we're talking about the arbitrary arrests and detention and imprisonment of trade union leaders. There are various countries where this is, of course, a huge issue, whether it's Cambodia, Indonesia, or the Philippines. And of course, China's record is extremely bad, with 1.8 million Uyghurs and ethnic Kazakhs and other Muslim minorities that have been detained, and there are severe human rights abuses, torture, political indoctrination, and of course systemic forced labor, which is now occurring in these mass internment camps, and constitute crimes really against humanity, and many of our global supply chains are at risk of tainted goods made with forced labor. So this is a huge issue for us, and while there's no legal text on this, and we will be raising it considerably. Now, I just wanted to turn to the chapter on the temporary movement of natural persons, chapter 9, and in particular Annex 4, which relates to the actual commitments that Australia made on temporary movement of natural persons. Often DFAT will highlight that it is just business or very high skilled business visitors or very high skilled professions that are part of the temporary movement of natural persons in this agreement. But when we look at the actual legal text, there are provisions for intercorporate transferees, contractual service suppliers, and independent executives. And all three actually link and relate back to the temporary skills shortage visa, which has a very broad range of occupations, and much broader than simply business executives. It's around 430 odd occupations, and there is both a short-term skills list and a long-term skill list. And of course, we know that many of people on those occupations are actually doing even lower skilled occupations than what are actually on the list, and are deeply and are often underpaid. And there's numerous studies highlighting the exploitation of these workers. So it's quite this chapter does link on those three examples, on the intercorporate transferees, the contractual service providers, and the independent executives. Now, but what we know is, and what we normally look at in this agreement, is whether labour market testing has been removed for this section. But actually, because of all other trade agreements with the RCEP countries, labour market testing has been removed for all RCEP countries already. So this is already a problem. And what we've been making the point is that this effectively entrenches already a substantial problem, because it doesn't seek to apply labour market testing or reinsert labour market testing. It seems to entrench what are already problematic areas. And of course, when you look at the annexes and you look at what other countries have put forward in the in that chapter, the temporary movement of natural persons chapter, we can see other countries have had greater restrictions on their labour markets. So it's by no means that Australia has to follow that example. If you look at Indonesia, there is an economics needs test, and there's substantial restrictions on a whole range of occupations, for example. So, Australia has one of the most open annexes to this chapter, and of course, the great criticism that we always give is that what they've done is essentially applied the lens of the goods market to the labour market. So they've essentially treated labour market testing as a tariff and something to be removed. But we know the labour market is extremely different to the goods market. So this chapter really just entrenched some of the things that have been contained in other free trade agreements with RCEP countries. I've also been asked to look at the government procurement section, and I just want to read out some of the Article 16.3 on the principles. The parties recognise the role of government procurement in furthering the economic integration of the region so as to promote growth and employment, where government procurement is expressly open to international competition. Each party, to the extent possible and appropriate, should conduct its government procurement in accordance with generally accepted government procurement principles as applied by that party. So there is general principles on expressly opening government procurement to international competition. However, the chapter is actually non-binding and does not have any market access commitments, but it does have a review process. So Article 16.6, the parties may review the chapter within the period stipulated in Article 20.8, the general review, with a view of improving the chapter in future to facilitate government procurement as agreed by the parties. So there is a review process, but the chapter is essentially non-binding. So there are general commitments, but isn't as bad as others due to the non-binding aspect of government of this chapter. So, in summary, our major concerns are the fact that there is no labour chapter at all, and I do wish to highlight that even some of the political parties where we may expect that they would be fighting for a labour chapter have said comments such as, well, these countries are members of the ILO, so there's not so much of a problem. Whereas where we're coming from, of course, is membership of the ILO does in no way at all guarantee good labour rights and those practices. Almost every country is a member of the ILO, and of course, these are fundamental human rights, and they should be part of the agreement. And we will be putting that right at the forefront of our criticisms of RCEP. And on the temporary movement of natural persons, while there is no labour market, while labour market testing isn't removed, it does entrench a position of where labour market testing has been removed in other agreements, and the intercorporate transferees, contractual service providers, and independent executives are linked to the TSS. So thank you very much. It was just a quick summary, but really happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Damien. We'll move on to our next speaker, Travis Wacey. He's the policy researcher at the Construction, Forestry, Mining and Energy Union's Forestry and Furnishing Products Division, which I think is now called the Manufacturing Division. And Travis is going to discuss the trade remedies provisions in the RCEP. So please go ahead, Travis, and I'll share the screen. Just hang on a sec.
Thanks, Peter. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, which I'm giving this presentation from, which, like Deborah, is the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past and present on what is and always was Aboriginal land. I'm also, in addition to that role, I've been the union's representative on the International Trade Remedies Forum, which is an advisory body, tripartite advisory body, which Damien's involved with at the ACTU and a number of other unions, the AMWU and the AWU, provide advice to the Australian government on Australia's anti-dumping and countervailing system. And
okay, I'm just going to find the, there we go.
So this is
better?
This is the paper that we tabled when we had the opportunity, like a number of others on this call, had to address the negotiators at the round of negotiations in Melbourne. So it's a pretty simple paper, but it reflects the principles that is really a industry position in Australia, both employers and unions. And it basically outlines the view that the anti-dumping and countervailing system shouldn't be fiddled with in bilateral and regional trade agreements. So you'll see at the top there, we've got, you know, the big ticks on it's okay to have a trade remedies chapter which reinforce the rights and obligations of RCEP members under the WTO anti-dumping agreement and the subsidies and countervailing measures agreement and the WTO agreement on safeguards. What we don't like is for the rights and obligations of, well, particularly Australian industry and Australian workers from the perspective that we're taking, but also other RCEP members to have their rights and obligations under those WTO agreements undermined by the terms of agreements in trade agreements, the terms of agreements in trade remedies chapters in agreements, and that's a position which we've discussed with in our global union federations, because there is a growing consensus about the importance of using these tools to foster industrial development and to potentially use them to also protect some of trade unions' objectives, such as workers' rights. So you'll see that that's what was subsequently tabled. I'm wondering, Peter, if you can move to the next version.
Yep.
The next version was provided to partners and also Australian negotiators. So I don't know if anyone can spot the difference, but there's a little bit more detail in terms of what specifically should not be included in the trade remedies chapter.
Yeah.
And this is basically a mechanism which Australia uses, which it was the worst kept secret in the world that China wanted prohibited through the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement negotiations. So it just goes into a little bit more detail to give Australian negotiators and our partners an idea of what to look out for. We didn't table the detailed version because we didn't want to give people ideas. Subsequently, since this, the WTO is actually in a dispute appeals process regarding photocopy paper imported from Indonesia, has said that this method is WTO compliant, this method of determining normal value. So did we have success? So drawing people's attention to the chapter itself, certainly it doesn't prohibit this sort of normal value determination, which is used to determine a dumping margin. However, there are some elements of the agreement in the Trade Remedies chapter, which are what we'd call WTO plus. The most obvious one is the notification period, which the chapter suggests that there needs to be a 20-day notification period prior to the initiation of an investigation to the exporting country. Compared to the TPP, that was a 7-day notification period. And compared to the WTO anti-dumping agreement, it just says you need to notify them before initiating the investigation, but doesn't dictate a time period. It's probably not the smartest thing to do, to give massive notification, certainly 20 days. That period would ultimately be used to potentially engage in intermittent dumping. So to increase exports and volumes of exports in that time, which could cause material injury to domestic industry. And it could also be used to dissuade, at attempts to dissuade the launching of that investigation. The other peculiarity in the agreement is a prohibition on what's known as zeroing. So essentially, in an anti-dumping investigation, when you were to calculate the dumping margin, what you'd usually do is calculate the normal value, which is the price of the good sold in the export country, or the reasonable cost of production, with the export prices. The difference of that normal value and the export prices would be the dumping margin, which would determine the level of dumping duty or tariff. What the United States does is, when considering those exports, instead of considering the trade weighted average of the goods under consideration for the investigation period, they'll only consider the goods which were imported at a dump price. For goods that were imported that weren't dumped, what they'll do is they'll essentially discount that, or zero it, or not include them in the trade weighted average. Ultimately, that increases the dumping margin significantly. Australia or none of the RCEP countries do that. And for years and years and years, the United States have been defended this methodology for determining dumping margin in the WTO. And the last investigation, the last determination from the WTO was essentially that they were able to do this, although they criticised elements of how they went about it. And a curious inclusion in the agreement, which prohibits zeroing, designed more for geopolitical and global trade considerations, particularly in light of the China-US trade war. So that was peculiar as well. Like other parts of the agreement, the Trade Remedies chapter is not binding, or there's no dispute mechanism associated with it. Just to touch base on one other element of the Trade Remedies agreement, you'll see there that we also give a tick to the inclusion of clauses establishing bilateral safeguard mechanisms. So these are essentially included in agreements so that following tariff reductions, if there's a surge of imports which causes serious injury to a domestic industry, that temporary emergency tariffs can be put back in place up to the level of the tariff reduction dictated by the agreement. I think, as I outlined earlier, we're generally supportive of this because it provides domestic industries with suitable protection. And it's important because the WTO agreement on safeguards has the same provisions, but it can't be applied exclusively to one particular country. So it needs to be applied across the board following a surge of imports. How this would effectively work in the Australian context, though, where we're not essentially offering tariff reductions as part of this agreement with any of the current partners, although potentially others that include it, basically makes it defunct. Another reason why it would be essentially defunct in the Australian context is that the competent authority for administrating Australia's safeguard system is the Productivity Commission, who essentially would not countenance the provision of safeguard duties, emergency tariffs on any goods on public interest grounds. It's kind of peculiar about Australia's system because no other countries in RCEP or essentially globally have a similar body administering their safeguard system. So it's been the long-standing position of our unions, and I think we're able to talk to the Labor Party as well prior to the last election, that that role from the Productivity Commission would be stripped and provided to the Anti-Dumping Commission, consistent with best global practice. But that maintains, that continues to be an ongoing campaign.
Okay.
I think I'll leave it there.
We're going to move now to Joseph Bradford. Joseph is the National Policy and Research Officer for the Community and Public Sector Union, State Division, based in Melbourne. It's a federated union covering the state public services and has members across Australia. Joey spent the last decade working for a number of predominantly public sector unions in Australia, New Zealand and the UK, and he's going to look at the Trade and Services chapter, the impacts on public services and other essential services.
Okay, thanks, Peter. I'll be talking briefly about the Trade and Services chapter and some of the impacts it has on public and essential services. So we can go to the first slide, please. The service rules in Chapter 8, what does it do? So it effectively aims to open up services to international investment and reduce government regulation. I guess one of the big issues with this is that it's effectively opening up some sectors to further privatisation or to be privatised, and it's really avoiding any kind of re-regulation of industries by governments. It's enforced by the state-to-state dispute process. So as Pat said earlier, there's no ISDS, which is good, but there can still be state-to-state disputes. The intention is for public services not to be excluded, but there is a definition of public services in there that is quite ambiguous. It states them as being services provided in the exercise of government authority, not on a commercial basis, nor in competition with other service providers. This is ambiguous in the context of that it's a competitive tendering process for new services. So if you look at what's happening in aged care sectors or in the emerging third sector, where public services are being effectively privatised in the community, this is only enabling this to happen further. There is no local presence required for service providers. Again, like Pat mentioned earlier, there's room then for kind of overseas companies or corporations to be able to have tax havens where they don't actually pay any tax on the service they're providing here in Australia. And I know Sector did a report maybe last year, it was exposing the aged care sector and how a lot of the companies providing aged care in Australia are keeping their profits offshore. Governments cannot limit numbers, location, or size of services or staffing numbers. So again, this is about basically not enabling governments to regulate industries or make changes in industries that they might be trying to improve standards in. So it's kind of a barrier to make an improvement in some areas should government choose to do that. And qualifications, licensing, and standards requirements must be objective, and they cannot be burdensome or a barrier to entry. Again, this is about trying to make sure that there's less control from the government to kind of set certain standards in place. Okay, next slide, please.
Okay.
Pat mentioned this earlier, to the reservations or services not covered by the rules. So Australia has chosen a negative list for Annex 2, which means all services are covered except for those listed in the reservations. And so it's kind of like a list A and a list B. List A reserves existing regulation at current state levels and some national regulation, but it freezes the regulation at current levels, and these cannot be increased or they cannot be improved. And this is a ratchet structure they have in place. There is a list B, and these other areas of regulation which governments can increase the level of regulation in the future, and it does provide some scope for re-regulation in these areas. We can look at slide 3, which is looking at list B, please. Peter?
Which one?
The one before that, sorry. Yeah, so these are the services that are reserved and allowed increased regulation in the future. So you have law enforcement, correctional services, income security insurance, social security insurance, social welfare, public education and public training, regulation of admissions, accreditation and funding of public and private education services, health, childcare, public utilities, public transport and public housing. Again, looking at what are some of the bigger areas that might not be covered in there. Aged care pops out again, and we'll talk about that in the next slide. Yes. So yes, what does it mean for the services that aren't reserved? So we're looking for aged care, for example, which isn't expressly reserved in there. If you're looking at kind of some of the recommendations that came out of the Royal Commission, and these look at things such as increasing staffing, having more qualified staff, and increasing standards of care, these would be limited by the RCEP rules. This is concerning for a number of reasons. I guess one is the fact that there are continuous campaigns by unions and continuous issues within sectors such as aged care to increase ratios of staff and increase standards of care and try to increase minimum regulation of staff in the industry. And the fact that the government is now putting more barriers in place, especially when, if you look at Victoria, for example, aged care was very adversely affected by COVID and exposed a number of issues. Not even given a proper PPE, you're not having enough staff, even having staff moving between 5 or 6 different waste homes because, because of the precarious nature of work there because it's so underfunded. It just exposes that even further. And then alongside that, you've got the same issue of tax evasion. We've got these businesses that, they're making money out of the care of people, and they're just continually they're not there to provide the service, but to get that money, and they're there to really make the most of these contracts by providing the minimum care. So, the less ability the government has to regulate that, the more this is going to be a problem in the future. We've also got an issue there with environmental services. It could have issues when you look at particularly limiting government regulation in terms of reducing carbon emissions, especially if some of these standards are seen as objective or burdensome. So it's really, again, limiting the ability to try to put some regulation or standards in place if we do want to try to regulate emissions in the future. So I guess it's like a quick summary of that all. I mean, if you're looking at what isn't worse, I mean, there is no ISDS, which is good, but again, that can be reviewed in 2 years. And there still is the possibility of state-to-state disputes. So there's still, there's still going to be repercussions if something is broken. There are some public services that are exempted through the negative list, but they're not all exempted. So there are areas, particularly again within the third sector, where, which is open for, deregulation and privatization and for these same issues to occur. And again, similar to other free trade agreements, it puts international corporations and businesses ahead of government rights to regulate industry. So it's putting kind of corporations, in front of the government in terms of being able to really take control of certain areas, particularly when looking at public services, especially when talking at areas of healthcare. It's putting their rights first, and it's enabling further privatisation, and this really can only be detrimental to public services in the future. And so, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Joey. I'd now like to introduce Katherine Tu. She's the head of campaigns and policy at ActionAid Australia. ActionAid is a global women's rights organisation working on the issues of economic and climate justice. Kat will give an overview on the gender impacts of the RCEP. So welcome, Kat.
Thanks, Peter and Pat, for holding this webinar. I also want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I am working from today, which is the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. Just to give you a brief overview as to ActionAid's work on this, we've been campaigning to make free trade agreements such as the RCEP gender just for over 2 years now. I'm going to speak about RCEP, but also more generally about free trade agreements and how they exacerbate existing gender inequality and how they have disproportionate impacts on women. So drawing on some of the research that ActionAid has done, but also on some of the work that some people on this call have done as well, such as Pat and Sophie. Peter, can I please get the presentation up?
Yeah.
Next slide, please. And the slide after. Yeah, so just to overview the impacts of the pandemic on gender equality, to give you a sense of how the impacts of gender equality from the pandemic have been bad. It's getting worse under COVID, and trade agreements like RCEP make it even worse, and that's why ActionAid is working on the issue. So some of the stats that we've been using in our work is there are up to 1 billion women in low paid and precarious employment that have been left jobless. So that's a stat from the ILO. There's been a surge in violence against women worldwide, found from research that ActionAid International conducted. So support services have been closed because of the crisis, and that's forced women to return to unsafe environments, and job losses have also made them dependent on their abusers. So in terms of a statistic, ActionAid looked at the number of cases from April last year to this year, and they found that countries like Bangladesh are experiencing a 900% increase, and that's only with the cases that have been reported. In times of crisis, generally, women and girls are first to be pulled out of schools, even though education is critical in the economic recovery. The Malala Fund estimates that we'll have 20 million more secondary school-aged girls that could be out of school by the end of the crisis. So pretty worrying, particularly for women and girls in the global south. If we go to the next slide. Yeah, so historically, there's been little consideration and analysis of the particular gender impacts of trade agreements. The secret nature of RCEP and other free trade agreements negotiation prohibits involvement of women and women's rights organisations. They're not able to see the text and they're not able to scrutinise it. And generally, the pushing of free trade agreements by governments relies on a set of assumptions that trade creates economic opportunities for those, particularly in the global south, and for women. And you see that with our government's policy as well in terms of aid for trade, where there's an assumption that more trade will create economic opportunities and reduce poverty. But as we will see or have seen, actually it's not supporting the development of workers, particularly in the global south. And it encourages basically a race to the bottom and the rise of export-oriented industries where women are overrepresented and where there's lots of deregulation, sorry about the noise, to attract corporations to come and do business and make profit. So the top line is a lot of these agreements actually prioritize corporate profit over the rights of human rights, women's rights, and the environment. Next slide, please. Yes, I'm going to talk about two main areas around how the RCEP affects gender equality. One is the access to decent work, and secondly, on public services. So as we've already heard, the RCEP contains no commitments to internationally agreed labour standards. that essentially leads to capital which searches for the cheapest labour and the lowest cost site of production so that they can make more profit. So if we look at the garment sector, which is an export-oriented manufacturing sector, in the Asia Pacific, it employs 5.2% of working women. So that's in specific countries, that looks like 1 in 5 women in Cambodia and 1 in 9 in Bangladesh and Myanmar. These are industries that where trade agreements have facilitated an environment where there are low wages, unsafe environments, and in some cases, gender-based violence. And the trade agreements don't, by encouraging competition and more foreign investment, they don't just push wages down in RCEP countries, but everywhere as countries seek to compete to attract foreign investment. One of ActionAid's recommendations for this is basically that we implement enforceable labour standards, which is similar to the union's asking, specifically to protect women and workers' rights and to stop the lowering of wages and conditions. And if we go to the next slide, please, Peter. Public services. So as we've heard, the rules encourage greater foreign investment and privatisation of public services such as aged care. And this is really important. Public services are really important to the realisation of gender equality, particularly in developing countries, because a lot of women in global south countries are forced to bear the burden of unpaid labour. So they spend a lot of time looking after sick or old loved ones. And as we heard, for example, aged care in Australia particularly is not exempt from privatisation through the reservation list. So it means that that can affect gender outcomes. And an effective way to support gender equality is to adequately fund public services, actually. And we're not, through the current way that trade agreements operate, we're not facilitating in the environment. I pulled out one of the stats from some of the ActionAid work as well. The ILO says that on current trends, it will actually take 209 years globally to close the gender gap spent on unpaid work. And the way that trade agreements are currently negotiated don't help us make that faster, which is very worrying. And so the recommendation we have is that provisions which threaten access to gender responsive public services in the RCEP and other free trade agreements should be removed. And I have a minor point around some of the stuff that Joey spoke to as well around the ratchet and standstill provisions which prevent governments from regulating in the public interest. That can also prevent governments from regulating to achieve gender equality as well, which is in this and the other sustainable development goals. So that's the end of my presentation around the gender impacts and how a lot of the impacts are magnified for women and girls because of the way trade agreements work. Thank you.